Imagine being 12 years old. You're dressed in white, your hair arranged with a spear point. Outside, you hear the crowd gathering, hundreds of strangers waiting to watch what happens next. Your mother is crying, but you don't know why yet. The man you met once last month is walking toward you, and everyone is smiling like this is normal. In a few hours, you'll understand why she's crying. In a few hours, you'll be carried through the streets while strangers scream obscenities at you. And when you finally arrive at a house you've never seen before, the worst part of the night will begin in the most public room of the home, where everyone can hear what happens next. This isn't fiction. This was a Roman wedding night. And what I'm about to tell you is so disturbing that Rome itself tried to erase it from history. The rituals I'm going to describe were documented by Roman writers, condemned by early Christians, and then mysteriously forgotten, buried, as if an entire civilization collectively decided some traditions were too dark to remember. By the end of this video, you'll understand why modern historians call it state-sanctioned trauma. You'll know about the god whose shrine required one final act of submission, and you'll never look at ancient Rome the same way again. But I need to warn you, this gets significantly darker than you might expect. Let's start with a fact that should make you pause. Under Roman law, a girl could be legally married at 12 years old. Not 16, not 14, 12. The age when most modern children are in 6th grade. But here's what makes it worse. This wasn't some edge case. This wasn't rare. Skeletal evidence from Roman burial sites shows that many girls were married and became mothers between 12 and 15 years old. One study of epitaphs from Rome found that the median age of first marriage for elite women was around 14. For lower classes, it could be even younger. Think about that for a moment. While we're talking about the glory of Rome, its engineering marvels, its philosophy and law, we're also talking about a society that systematically married off children to adult men. And the men, the grooms, were typically in their late 22nd or early 32nd, sometimes older. The age gap wasn't just large, it was designed to be large. It was a feature, not a bug, because it ensured maximum power imbalance. Roman jurists loved to talk about consensus, the idea that marriage required agreement from both parties. They wrote elaborate legal texts about how both the bride and groom had to consent. It sounds progressive, doesn't it? It sounds almost modern, but let's examine what consent actually meant in practice. Picture this. You're 13 years old. Your father is the pater familias, the head of the family. Under Roman law, his power over you is almost absolute. He controls your property, your legal status, your entire future. He has the right of patrio potestas, paternal power, which in early Rome even included the right to execute his own children for disobedience. Now this man, whose word is quite literally law in your household, tells you that you will marry a 30-year-old stranger. He selected a man who will advance his political alliances, a man who will merge landholdings or settle a debt, a man you might have met once briefly in a formal setting. Do you say no? Can you say no? This is what Roman consent looked like. It was technically required by law, but it existed within a system so fundamentally coercive that the word itself becomes almost meaningless. The earliest form of Roman marriage was called cum manu, literally with hand meaning under control. And the legal language around it is chilling because it describes the marriage using the same terminology used for property transfer. The bride passed from her father's manus to her husband's manus. She went from being under one man's legal control to being under another's. She wasn't technically a slave. Roman law was very clear about that distinction. But the language of ownership was everywhere. In this arrangement, any property she inherited didn't become hers, it became her husband's. If she had money, it was now his money. If she received gifts, they were his gifts. Legally, she was absorbed into his family, as if her original family had never existed. Now, it's true that by the late Republic and into the Empire, a different form called sine manu became more common, giving women more independence, but we're going to focus on that earlier, darker period. Because those rituals, those traditions, they cast a shadow that lasted for centuries, and some of them never really went away. On the day before her wedding, the bride underwent a transformation ritual that was deeply symbolic, and when you understand the symbolism, deeply disturbing. Her hair was parted using the point of a spear, not a comb, not a decorative pin. A spear. Specifically, a spear that had been used to kill a gladiator. Let that sink in. The tool of violence still carrying the memory of death was used to prepare her for marriage. Why? Ancient sources say it was for luck, for fertility, for protection. But the message is hard to miss. Marriage, like war, was about conquest, about one party yielding to another, about power. Her hair was then arranged into 6 braids, the sex crimes, a style apparently worn by the ancient Vestal virgins. She wore a white tunic, the tunic erector, woven in an ancient style. Everything about her appearance was designed to mark her as Lionel, caught between girlhood and wifehood, between her father's house and her husband's, between her old identity and her new one. And around her waist was tied the knot of Hercules, a special knot that only her husband was permitted to untie. On their wedding night, in their wedding bed, the symbolism was explicit. Her body was locked and he held the key. When evening came, the most public part of the ceremony began, the deducio and dome, the procession to the groom's house. And this is where Roman wedding ritual stops looking ceremonial and starts looking like a reenactment of violence, because this procession was deliberately designed to echo one of Rome's founding myths, the rape of the Sabine women. You probably know this story. According to legend, early Rome had a shortage of women. So Romulus, Rome's founder, invited the neighboring Scions to a festival, and then Roman men violently abducted the Sabine women and forced them into marriage. It's one of Rome's most famous stories depicted in countless paintings and sculptures. But here's what's disturbing. Romans didn't just tell this story as a dark chapter from their past. They celebrated it. They reenacted it at every elite wedding. Ancient writers describe the wedding procession using language that makes it sound like an abduction. The groom would seize his bride. In some accounts, he would literally tear her from her mother's arms in a mock struggle. The bride was expected to display pure, a word that means modesty, shame, or reluctance. She was supposed to resist, to seem afraid, to cry. Now, imagine you're that 13-year-old girl. You've been told your whole life that this is normal, that this is what good girls do. So you perform the resistance that's expected of you. You pull away from your mother. You hesitate at the door. You make the appropriate show of fear. But here's the question that should haunt us. When does performed fear become real fear? When does ritual terror become actual terror? At hat point, does the performance merge with reality? For many of these girls, we have to assume the fear was completely genuine. They were children being handed over to strange men in a public ceremony designed to symbolize their loss of autonomy. The performance and the reality were the same thing. As the procession wound through the streets of Rome, something happened that sounds almost surreal. Crowds would gather to watch, and they didn't just watch silently. They participated. They sang what were called Facine verses, songs that ancient writers describe as obscene, vulgar, and often cruel. These weren't gentle blessings for a happy marriage. They were graphic sexual jokes, insults, crude predictions about the wedding night. Roman writers claimed this tradition served an important function. The obscenity was meant to ward off evil spirits who might be drawn by the couple's good fortune. Jealous gods needed to be distracted by vulgarity. But let's think about this from the bride's perspective. You're being marched through the streets of Rome, torn from your mother's arms, surrounded by strangers who are shouting sexual comments about what's going to happen to you in a few hours. You're 12, maybe 13, maybe 14 years old. This wasn't just a party. This was a psychological gauntlet designed to break down your old identity and prepare you for submission. Every element, the mock kidnapping, the expected fear, the public obscenity was reinforcing the same message. Your will, your autonomy, your selfhood no longer mattered. The procession happened at night, lit by torches. This wasn't for practical reasons. it was symbolic. The torch was another echo of the Sabine rape myth. When the Romans abducted the Sabine women, it happened at a festival at night by torchlight. So as the bride was led through the streets, the flickering flames would cast shadows on the crowd, on their faces as they shouted and laughed. The bride would be surrounded by fire and noise and jeering strangers, all of it designed to overwhelm her senses, to mark this as a rupture, a point of no return. One Roman poet described it as a night when shame flees and modesty is overcome. The language is telling. The goal wasn't to celebrate the bride's happiness. It was to break her modesty, to overcome her shame, to prepare her for what came next, and what came next happened in the most public room of her new home. When the procession finally reached the groom's house, there was another ritual that sounds almost romantic until you understand what it meant. The bride was forbidden from stepping over the threshold herself. To trip or stumble would be a terrible omen, so she had to be carried over it, lifted by attendants or slaves, and brought into the house. Ancient sources explain this as a practical measure to avoid bad luck. They say it was about appeasing household spirits, about starting the marriage on the right foot, and maybe that's all it was. But there's another way to read this to all. The bride did not enter her new life on her own 2 feet. She did not walk into this house by her own power. She was brought in, carried, passive. From the very first moment, the message was clear. This is not your house. You are not here by your own choice or your own movement. You're here because you have been brought here. Once inside, standing in the atrium, the grand public heart of the Roman home, the bride would perform one of the most famous rituals of Roman marriage. She would recite the words, Ubi te Gassus, ego Gaia, where you are, Gas, I am Gaia. Now, neither of them was probably actually named Gas or Gaia. These were just generic names like saying John and Jane. But the meaning of the phrase is what matters. It wasn't, I will follow you or I will support you or even I will obey you. It was more fundamental than that. It was where you are, I am. Your location defines my location. Your identity subsumes my identity. Modern scholars debate how common this phrase actually was. Some think it might have been more of an ideal that writers described rather than something every bride actually said. But the fact that it was held up as the ideal tells us everything we need to know about what Roman marriage was supposed to be. The bride was declaring that she no longer existed as a separate entity. She was now an extension of her husband. Where he was, she was. What he was, she was. It was the death of one identity and the birth of another. But unlike a natural death, his one was public, ritualized, and forced. Now, we need to talk about the space where all of this happened, the atrium. In a Roman house, the atrium wasn't a private space. It was the most public room in the entire home. It's where the family greeted guests, where business was conducted, where the family displayed their wealth and status, where the household shrine stood with images of ancestors watching over everything. And it's where the wedding bed was placed, not in a private bedroom in the atrium. This placement was intentional. The lectus genialis, the marriage bed, was a significant piece of furniture, richly decorated, draped in fine fabrics. It was meant to be seen. It was a symbol of the family's fertility, their continuation, their legitimacy. But here's what that means in practice. Everything that was about to happen would happen in the most public space in the house, surrounded by symbols of family honor and ancestral expectation, in a room where guests had just been celebrating. Privacy, as we understand it, didn't exist for the Roman bride on her wedding night. We're about to get to the part of the ritual the historians debate and the early Christians called obscene beyond description. But before we do, if you're finding this dive into Rome's darkest traditions as disturbing and fascinating as I am, hit that subscribe button. We go where mainstream history fears to tread, uncovering the stories that ancient civilizations tried to bury. And trust me, what comes next is exactly why they wanted this forgotten. There's a persistent myth about Roman wedding nights that I need to address directly, because it's often exaggerated. But the kernel of truth is disturbing enough. The myth is that consummation was a fully public spectacle, that guests would actually watch, that the curtains around the bed would be left open, that it was basically a performance. Modern historians are pretty confident this is an exaggeration. There's no solid evidence that consummation itself was witnessed by crowds of people. But, and this is important, the truth is disturbing enough without that exaggeration. The bed was in the atrium. The door to the bedroom, if there even was a separate room, was likely left ajar. Attendants waited nearby. The pronuba, the matron of honor, who was supposed to guide the bride, was often right outside. So, while there probably weren't people actively watching, there also wasn't anything we would recognize as privacy. The bride knew people were close by. She knew they could hear. She knew that what was happening to her was happening in a space that had been just hours earlier full of guests. Remember the knot of Hercules? The special knot around the bride's waist that marked her as off-limits, as locked, as not yet claimed. This is when it was untied, and only the husband could untie it. Ancient sources present this as a tender moment, a challenge of skill and dexterity. Some writers suggest that if the husband struggled with the knot, it was a sign the marriage would face difficulties. If he untied it smoothly, it meant fertility and prosperity. But strip away the romantic framing and look at what's actually happening. A grown man is undressing a child because, again, she was often 12 to 14 years old in a ritualized act that everyone present understood to be the prelude to consummation. The knot was called the knot of Hercules. Hercules, the greatest hero of classical mythology, famous for his strength, his violence, his conquest of monsters. That's the symbolism chosen for this moment. Not gentle, not tender. The symbolism is conquest. I want to be very clear about something because it's easy to read about these rituals in the abstract and not think about the reality. We're talking about grown men in their late 20s, 30s, sometimes older, being given legal access to the bodies of girls who were 12, 13, 14 years old. Girls who hadn't chosen their husbands. Girls who had been handed over by their fathers in a power transaction that had nothing to do with their will or desire. Modern historians don't dance around this anymore. They use words like coercion. They use words like institutional abuse because that's what it was. Roman law tried to frame it as consensual. Roman culture tried to frame it as sacred and traditional. But no amount of ritual or legal language changes the fundamental reality. These were children being given to adult men for sex, and the entire weight of Roman society was arranged to make that seem normal. The pronuba was usually a married woman, often a relative, whose job was to guide the bride through the wedding night. She was supposed to be a reassuring presence, someone who had been through this before and could offer comfort and advice. But think about what that role actually entailed. She was there to make sure the bride went through with it, to calm her if she panicked, to encourage her if she resisted, to essentially ensure that the transaction was completed. Some sources suggest the pronuba would remain outside the door, not watching, but present, available, ready to intervene if needed. If needed for what? What kind of intervention might be necessary on a wedding night? The sources don't say explicitly, but the implication is clear enough. Her role wasn't really about comfort. It was about compliance. Now, we come to the part of the story that's so controversial that mainstream historians often skip over it entirely. And I need to be very careful here, because our sources for this are problematic. Almost everything we know about this ritual comes from late Roman Christian writers. People like St. Augustine, who were actively trying to make paganism look as depraved as possible. They had an agenda. They were writing propaganda. But they describe a cult practice so disturbing that we have to at least examine it, even if we can't be certain it actually happened. The god's name was Mutinus Tutunus, or sometimes Mutinus Tutunus, a fertility deity. O's worship involved a sacred effigy, and that effigy was a giant phallus. According to these hostile Christian sources, before the wedding night proper, the bride had to perform one final ritual. She was led to a shrine or a sacred space where the effigy of Mutinus Tutunus stood. And there, in front of witnesses, she was made to sit on it. The stated purpose was fertility. It was supposed to ensure she would be able to bear children. It was framed as a blessing, a sacred rite that connected her to the power of the god. But let's call this what it is. If this practice actually existed, and that's a big if, it was institutionalized sexual violation dressed up as religious ceremony. Now, here's the problem. We have to be extremely skeptical of these accounts. Why? Because they only appear in Christian sources who are actively trying to demonize pagan practices. No pagan Roman writer ever describes this ritual. Not one. It's entirely possible this was a wild exaggeration, or a complete fabrication, or a misunderstanding of a different, less extreme ritual. Or maybe it was a real but extremely localized practice that wasn't common at all, and Christian writers seized on it because it fit their narrative. We genuinely don't know. But here's why I'm including it. Even if it wasn't real, even if it was propaganda, the fact that Christians could allege this and be believed tells us something important. It tells us that Roman wedding customs were already disturbing enough that this kind of accusation was plausible, that people could hear this story and think, yeah, that tracks with everything else I know about how Rome treats brides. Whether or not the mutinous tutinous ritual actually happened, we know for certain that Roman wedding ceremonies were filled with acts designed to humiliate and break down the bride's autonomy. The mock kidnapping, the obscene songs, the public placement of the bed, the attendants waiting nearby. The entire ritual structure was about submission. And fertility rituals in Rome were often uncomfortably physical. We know that the cult of Bonadea, the Lupercalia festivals where men would run through the streets hitting women with strips of goat hide to promote fertility, the fastinum, the phallus charm displayed in homes and streets as protection and blessing. Rome had a complicated relationship with sexual symbolism and religious practice, so while we can't confirm the mutinous tutinous ritual with certainty, we also can't dismiss it as completely implausible. It would fit the pattern. Here's a question that should bother us. If these rituals were so central to Roman life, why don't Roman writers talk about them more? We have thousands of pages from Roman historians. Livy, Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny, men who wrote exhaustively about wars, politics, scandals, and daily life. But when it comes to the details of wedding nights, silence, vague references, euphemisms, the standard explanation is that these were domestic matters, women's matter. And Roman male historians simply weren't interested. They were focused on the public sphere, the forum, the Senate, the battlefield. And there's truth to that. But some modern historians suggest something else might be going on. As Rome grew more sophisticated, as the empire expanded and absorbed Greek culture, as philosophy evolved, as legal systems became more complex, certain archaic practices started to look embarrassing. The Romans loved to present themselves as civilized, as the culmination of human achievements, as the people who brought law and order to a chaotic world. And yet here they were, still reenacting ritual kidnappings, still marrying 12-year-olds to 30-year-olds, still conducting wedding nights that looked more like institutionalized trauma than romantic celebration. Some historians argue that by the late Republic and early Empire, educated Romans were already trying to distance themselves from these practices. They kept the rituals because tradition was sacred, but they stopped talking about them because they were becoming aware of how they looked. When Christianity took over Rome, a massive historical rewriting began. Early Christians were deeply uncomfortable with pagan sexuality. They were especially uncomfortable with rituals that seemed to involve coercion or public spectacle. So they did two things. First, they condemned these practices in the strongest possible terms, sometimes exaggerating them to make paganism look worse. Second, they worked to replace them with Christian marriage ceremonies that emphasized different values. Over time, the old rituals faded. New ones took their place, and the memory of what Roman wedding nights actually involved became fuzzy, then uncertain, then almost mythological. By the medieval period, when European culture was looking back to Rome as its cultural ancestor, There was a strong incentive to remember the good parts, the law, the engineering, the philosophy, and forget the uncomfortable parts. You might be wondering why I'm spending 28 minutes digging into wedding rituals from 2,000 years ago. Who cares? It's ancient history. But here's why it matters. Because we're taught to revere Rome. It's the foundation of Western civilization, our legal systems, our government structures, our architecture. They all trace back to Rome. When people talk about traditional values, or the classical world, Rome is what they mean. And if we're going to claim Rome as our cultural ancestor, we need to be honest about what that ancestry includes. Not just the Colosseum and the aqueducts, but also the systematic control of women's bodies. Not just the philosophy and law, but also the state-sanctioned trauma of wedding nights. History isn't just about celebrating achievements, it's about understanding systems of power and how they perpetuate themselves. And Rome's wedding rituals were a masterclass in social control. How to take a human being with autonomy and will and systematically break that down until compliance seems natural. So the next time you see a romanticized painting of ancient Rome, marble statues flowing to noble senators debating philosophy, remember what was happening in the homes. Remember the 12-year-old girls being dressed with spear points. Remember the crowds shouting obscenities as brides were paraded through streets. Remember the wedding beds placed in public rooms where privacy was impossible. Remember that power doesn't just express itself through laws and armies. Sometimes the most absolute power is exercised in the most intimate moments, dressed up as tradition, blessed by religion, and then conveniently forgotten when it becomes embarrassing. The Romans tried to erase this from history. Early Christians tried to rewrite it. Modern culture tries to ignore it. But the evidence is still there if you know where to look. And now you know where to look. If this dive into history's darkest corners changed how you see the ancient world, hit that like button and subscribe. We're not here to make the past look noble. We're here to show you what really happened. And trust me, there are plenty more stories that civilizations tried to bury,